Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Guts and Glory World War II podcast, the second podcast on this channel. So, now, Chapter 3, Blitzkrieg. Germany conquers Europe in 10 months. Gentlemen, you are about to witness the most famous victory in history. German Führer Adolf Hitler in a speech to his staff on the eve of the Battle of France. In May 1940, two of the world's most powerful nations were poised with an earth-shattering battle that would morph the entire landscape of Europe into a gigantic explosion. On paper, the battle was going to be longer, more brutal, and more grueling than trying to solve the world's most evil algebra word problem while people are shooting at you. Along the Rhine River, which forms part of the border between Germany and France, stood the German Wehrmacht, Germany's entire military, consisting of the Air Force, Navy, and Army, 3.35 million soldiers decked out for war. Across the river from them definitely stood 3.3 million French and British troops, entrenched in massively impressive forts and defensive positions they'd been working for over a decade. The Germans had a big advantage when it came to numbers of aircraft, but the Allies had twice as much artillery, 14,000 artillery pieces to just 7,000 German guns. The French also had nearly 1,000 more tanks than Germany did, and the French tanks were more heavily armored and carried a larger main gun than the German Panzer tanks. So how did France fall in 6 weeks? To understand the French defeat, you need to understand the way World War I went down. You see, just 20 years earlier, these same two sides had collided head-to-head in the bloodiest conflict the world had ever witnessed. Tens of thousands of men died in World War I while fighting for just a few miles of territory. Both sides suffered monumentally, and in the end, nothing had been accomplished. Troops would run across open ground and get mowed down by machine guns, and those who somehow survived would run back to their own lines to get out of bullet streams. The guys who had done all the killing would be like, okay, cool, sweet, we wore them down, and launch an attack on their own, only to be mowed down by machine guns themselves. The whole bloody war was the military equivalent of two guys taking turns punching each other in the face really hard, and this fighting style had taught the French commanders that power lay in defense rather than attack. The guy with the best fortress won, and the dumb guy enough to charge that fortress died. So France decided to repeat the tactics that had already defeated the Germans once, build an unrivaled line of trenches along the French-German border, pack it with hundreds of thousands of men and artillery, and wait for the Germany to attack so France would waste them with machine guns. What they hadn't planned on was the man known as Hurricane Heinz Guderian and his new tactic for Germany military success, the Blitzkrieg. Born in Kulm, Germany in 1888, Heinz Guderian was a staff officer during World War I, and he learned a very different lesson than the French did from that long, horrible war. Rather than sit back and chill, the key to success was to launch quick, unexpected attacks as fast as possible. Sucker punched the enemy's weak points with overwhelming might. France could dig their holes and wait, but Guderian wanted to be the guy throwing the punches, and he realized that modern technology had given him the perfect tools to lob haymakers at the French, the bomber aircraft and the battle tank. Before Heinz Guderian, a lot of military generals would use tanks the same way they'd use a machine gun nest. Spread them out evenly across their lines so you can have one in your area to assist at all times. Guderian thought this was as dumb as heck. In 1937, he wrote a book called Achtung, Panzer, which is an awesome book title because it's just German for attention, tank. In his book, he wrote, "You hit somebody with your fist and not with your fingers spread," and argued the best way to do things was to slam all your tanks together into one big tank unit, rev up your engines, and then roll over top of anyone who stood in front of you. Think of it this way. Blitzing The quarterback in football is a reference to the Blitzkrieg. If you want to get the quarterback before he can throw the ball, you need your big linebackers to run as fast as they can from directions the offense isn't expecting and nail their quarterback when he least expects it. Heinz Guderian and the Germans had already had their first opportunity to test out Blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war, when they launched a full-scale invasion of Poland in September 1939. Poland's military were full of tough, dedicated soldiers, but there were 2.5 million Germans and 1,500 Panzer tanks against just 2,800 Poles who were still riding around on horses because they didn't have enough trucks to carry their troops. The Blitzkrieg worked with terrifying efficiency. Nazi paratroopers landed behind enemy lines and quickly took out communications and headquarters buildings, cutting off the eyes and ears of Poland's frontline forces. Aircraft from the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, screamed in from overhead, shot up Polish airplanes while they were still in the tarmac, then ruthlessly dropped bombs on any ground target larger than a porta potty. Before the smoke could clear in all these explosions, 5 full-strength divisions of terrifying steel Panzer tanks rolled in through the gaps, blasting high-explosive artillery shells and machine gun bullets in every direction. The Panzers used their speed to quickly surround the Polish army and force their surrender. Despite heroic efforts from one small pockets of Polish resistance, particularly in the capital, Warsaw, the Poles were completely conquered in just under a month. Hitler celebrated by high-fiving Stalin and splitting the country between them as if they were arguing over pizza slices. At this point in time, Hitler and Stalin were frenemies who were nice to each other's face but were totally plotting to double-cross each other at the first sign of weakness. During the invasion of Poland, Hurricane Heinz had commanded the 19th Panzer Corps with amazing success, but he knew that the true test of Blitzkrieg was going to be in the battle about to take place in France. France knew war was coming and made great efforts to defend against it. They built a Maginot Line on the France-Germany border and made it the most impenetrable defense position ever constructed in human history. Germany decided to go around the defenses and attack through Holland and Belgium as they had in World War I. France also had a plan in place to counterattack and encircle them. Really, the only place France wasn't a tank-proof steel fortress was a small strip of land in southeast Belgium known as the Ardennes Forest. And only because the woods were so incredibly dense that there had been no way the heck you could drive a tank through there. So naturally, that's exactly what the Germans did. On the morning of May 5th, 1940, Germany rolled 7 full-strength Panzer divisions, each with about 300 tanks, straight through the Ardennes forest and out into the open countryside of eastern France, as German Stuka dive bombers tore down from the sky and mashed up British and French artillery positions. Heinz Guderian and his 19th Panzer Corps hauled forward at full speed. The reek had smoking husks of burned-out French trucks and tanks. Blowing through the countryside, Guderian didn't worry about the French positions on this flank, didn't wait for his own infantry, ground soldiers, didn't do anything other than step on the gas and shoot at anything he deemed a threat. Despite his high rank, Guderian himself constantly worked on the front lines of the battlefield, driving around in a car with a radio so he could be in touch with his men. All along the rest of the battle lines, the Germans attacked. Tons of paratroopers landed in Belgium and Holland, secured bridges, and captured key government and military objectives. Along the Maginot Line, there were also some attacks, but these were only designed to keep France occupied while Guderian's panzers rolled along behind their lines. The German tanks quickly turned back a couple of brave but useless counterattacks by French tanks under a colonel named Charles de Gaulle, and blasted apart the British tank force outside the town of Arras. With their opposition thoroughly demolished, The Germans drove all the way to the coast of France and started rolling up on the now retreating Allied forces. Guderian very nearly destroyed the entire British expeditionary force, but a heroic defense by the French army allowed the Brits to reach the port city of Dunkirk and get their guys out of there. The retreat was so desperate that Britain commandeered everything from civilian fishing boats to luxury yachts to wooden sailing ships in order to ferry nearly 340,000 British and French troops back across the English Channel, all while constantly being dive-bombed by German Stuka bombers and strafed by fighter aircraft. Britain managed to save its army at Dunkirk, but it was pretty much over for France by this point. Guderian and his panzers turned south and began their occupation of Paris on June 14, 1940. On the 22nd, Hitler forced the French government to sign an unconditional surrender in the same train car where Germany had surrendered after World War I. Then he blew up the stone monument commemorating the surrender. Apparently, he was still pretty bitter about the whole World War I thing. In under 6 weeks, France had suffered 300,000 casualties, compared with just 156,000 German casualties. Over 1.9 million Allied troops surrendered. France was out of the war. Britain was licking its wounds across the Channel, and the United States was still considered a neutral power. Just like that, Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany ruled a European empire that stretched from the Pyrenees Mountains to the Ukrainian border. The Panzer IV. The only German tank produced throughout World War II was the ever-present Panzer Mark IV tank, measuring 23 feet in length and weighing in at 20 tons. This medium tank had an 11.9-liter V12 engine that generated 300 horsepower and could haul along at 26 miles per hour. It was equipped with a 75mm gun and two 7.92mm MG34 machine guns, one in the hull and one in the turret, and rocked 50mm frontal armor to deflect incoming shells and bazooka rounds. It was operated by a crew of 5, the driver, a radio operator, a loader, a gunner, and the tank commander.